David Crow. Thank you for tuning in to episode 226 of my weekly radio show, The Infectious Myth. Email me at david.crow@theinfectiousmyth.com, that's Crow with an E. Join the discussion and like us at facebook.com/theinfectiousmyth. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at InfectiousMyth. Listen Tuesdays at 2 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time on prn.fm or subscribe to the podcasts on iTunes or other programs. You can listen to any of the last 5 episodes over the phone by dialing the U.S. number 701-719-0990. You can leave a message at 862-800-6805. Make sure you indicate that the question is for The Infectious Myth. I don't know you're a listener till I hear from you, so send me a message letting me know how you stay in touch with the show and what you like about it. If you include your mailing address, I'll send you a little thank you gift, one of the bookmarks I make by hand, using my own photos. I do really love to hear from you, so don't be shy. You can make a one-time donation to the expenses of the show via PayPal using the email david.crow@theinfectiousmyth.com or commit to monthly donations at patreon.com or liberapay.com, where we are also Infectious Myth, one word. We appreciate all of our listeners, but if you want this show to continue to grow and improve, consider paying a small amount for the information that you are gleaning, for the support you get for some non-mainstream ideas and the challenges to others. If you'd like me to speak at a meeting of an organization you're a member of on any topic you think I have an interesting and worthwhile opinion on, I'd be happy to discuss this with you. I appreciate commenting and suggesting guests. I appreciate your financial support as well. Thanks for listening and for recommending this show to your friends. And now let's go to this week's interview, which is once again on the topic of gender dysphoria. In this interview, we'll be focusing on the psychological aspects rather than the medical dangers of hormone treatment. Dr. Oren Amitay is a registered psychologist who, since 2000, has worked with a diverse group of clients and patients in individuals, couples, family, and group counseling. He's been registered with the College of Psychologists of Ontario since 2008. He's frequently appeared in court as an expert witness with respect to his assessments of parenting capacity, psychological and personality functioning, intelligence, and emotional intelligence. He's taught 20 different psychology courses for a total of 180 times at 5 different universities over the past 2 decades, including psychology of human sexuality and psychology of gender. Dr. Amitay has appeared on virtually every major TV, radio, and newspaper outlet in Canada, discussing hundreds of different issues and stories. Government and private companies have also hired him for his ability to communicate complex psychological issues in plain English. He's based in Ontario, Canada. Welcome to the show, Dr. Amitay.
Thank you, David.
So in my last show, I talked to an endocrinologist, William Malone, mostly about the dangers of medical transition, the dangers of the hormones in particular. But today I wanted to focus more on the psychological side of gender dysphoria. If we want to support people with gender dysphoria, which I hope we all do, what is the best way to do that?
And that is a very tricky question, and I've spoken to some of the experts, and there's no one right way to do it, but if you listen to certain people, what I call the trans, and you can't see me doing it, but the trans quote-unquote activists, there's only one way, and everyone I've spoken to who's reasonable admits that it really depends on the person, and the fact is, for some people, their dysphoria seems immune basically to any type of treatment except for the more radical types of interventions, which would be hormonal treatment or hormonal therapy or even surgery. But the problem is, it seems that the most radical interventions only apply to a small proportion of the population, yet, again, the trans activists are pushing it, making it seem like everybody must have it. Any child who claims to be dysphoric, who's slightly gender non-conforming, should be rushed into some type of transitioning, social first, and then put them onto hormones quickly. And if you speak to them, if I say it so bluntly like that, these activists will say, we never say that, and no, we want to be reasonable, we want to have proper assessment to make sure that if a child's only, gender non-conforming but not actually dysphoric, that we don't push them in this direction. That's what they claim, But if you do the literature, if you speak to the people who've gone through the process, they will say there are far too many people who will push you in that direction. Again, the most radical and irreversible treatments.
Well, I think the media is doing this. The difference between a story I hear in the media is that when you hear about gender dysphoria in the media, it's almost always about transition, and it always talks about the benefits, and there's very little, if anything, about any adverse consequences. But what I've seen from chat groups about children who maybe have decided to detransition, maybe as adults, that it's a much darker story. And as long as the media portrays the beautiful story of people who transition, all of a sudden their life is without problems, I think it's going to encourage people. Tell me your assessment of how the media has played a role.
Well, it's not just the media, but you're absolutely right. It's being glorified. And I want to tell you an anecdote, and I've got the emails to prove them, where so as a psychologist in Ontario, I was part of an organization called the Ontario Psychological Association. I've now been banned from it, apparently for life, and we'll get into how that happened.
Mm-hmm.
But and the reason being basically that I took a very harsh tone with my colleagues, saying, "Look, it's bad enough that the media and lay people and activists are presenting a very biased and I think unfounded narrative of this, as you just said, everything will be great if you transition." When I know for a fact that's not the case for a lot of people. So one of the psychologists with whom I was discussing this, he said to me something along the lines of, "Oh, come on. Are you going to tell me that some teenager would transition given how much stigma there is against trans people?" And and I said, "Where have you been? Whether it's the media or more commonly online forums, and those types of, that type of social media," I said, "it's being rewarded, it's being glorified. And for any child who feels like an outcast, who feels uncomfortable, not necessarily in their gender, but in their identity, they don't feel they belong to, their peer groups, which is very common among teens and preteens. So for anyone like that, if they're told, hey, here's a ticket to not only to an answer as to why you're feeling this way, but also you're going to be glorified, your life's going to be much better, and we have a whole bunch of people here who are going to welcome you, and they are going to be your friends forever." Okay, when teens are presented with that, and they see other people doing the same thing and supposedly being rewarded, they are going to be more inclined to do it as well. And for a psychologist to deny that reality, I was so frustrated that I was basically banging my head against the wall, trying to tell them that, look, if you don't know what's going on in the, let's say, society today among certain groups, then don't speak out, because you're not helping. You, as someone who's taken an oath basically to help the public, to protect the public, to provide care to the public, for you to be that ignorant about such matters is pretty much doing a disservice to the very people we're supposed to serve.
Well, I don't know what you think. I think the tide is changing somewhat. There was a letter recently in England from a doctor from Oxford complaining about the actions of, I think, what in England is called the GIDS,
yes,
the gender dysphoria clinic over there, which he believes is pushing towards the hormones, pushing towards transition. One of the points that seems to have come out a few times is that if you socially transition, that raises, like you quote not yourself, but an organization known as WPATH, saying that dysphoria persisted into adulthood for only 6 to 23% of children. But it seems that if you transition socially, the percentage that continue to transition goes up, along with all the challenges that brings, such as problems that may result from surgery and things like that.
Yes, and that's why, as a psychologist, it's frustrating, because I know how the mind works. And, look, a lot of first-year psychology students can learn the same thing. The basic fact of, if you take a path, if you take a step in a certain direction, and there's so much weighing on it, and you commit yourself to it so strongly, the further you go along, even just one or two steps, let alone, like, let's say socially transitioning as a child and then going to, let's say, puberty blockers, the more you go along the path, the harder it gets to suddenly, this is for adults, let alone children, to reverse course and say, you know what, I think I made a mistake.
Well, I guess, many of us can't really understand what it really is like to have gender dysphoria, but there's many situations, for example, people marry hastily and then realize that it's a bad relationship, but by now they have a couple of kids, and extracting yourself just seems more difficult than just sticking it out, right? That's maybe an example of where you make a decision, you later realize it was wrong, but you've built so much around that decision that it's harder to get out of it.
Yeah, and I literally just talked about this morning in my human sexuality class. I was talking about the things that people consciously and largely unconsciously do in those situations, because very few people have the psychological and mental wherewithal to be able to say, "Whoa, I made a terrible mistake." And many people might practice. You brought up the most common. That's exactly the example I gave, where getting into a relationship and you've invested so much, whether there's children or not. Children end up being one of the investments. You do things to make it almost impossible to extricate yourself from the situation, because then you don't have to live with the fact that I made a mistake, I know it, and I did nothing to get out of it. So people lie to themselves. And again, these are adults. When you have a child or a teen, when they're dealing with something as literally the most profound thing you can think about, which is your own personal identity. I've often said this is not a gender identity issue. This is a personal identity with many of these people. And so when you do that, there's no greater investment in a reality than your own personal self and personal identity. So yes, it's virtually impossible for a teen or a child to reverse course at that point, and that's why the time that people are able to break through that cognitive dissonance is when things get so bad that they can no longer lie to themselves, and that's why we're seeing more and more young adults coming out and saying, "I am detransitioning or desisting because I realized this is not who I am, and I was lied to." And it breaks my heart. And this is, again, I hope your listeners understand. As a psychologist, I've spoken to those people. I've spoken to the families who've begged and pleaded me. I get letters, emails, and calls from around the world, weekly, from someone going through this, and they're saying there was nothing that we can do. And more governments, whether it's my government in Ontario or in Canada or other countries, are making policies that make it harder for parents to intervene, to say, whoa, let's not act in haste. Let's really take a proper approach. And it's getting harder for them to do that, and schools are getting involved, and the government's getting involved, Child Protective Services are getting involved, and they are basically telling parents, you are a monster if you dare not affirm your child's gender. And look, if a child says, I'm gay or I'm trans or something like that, and the parent disowns them or abuses them or something, then yes, they're a monster.
Well, there's two extremes, I guess. You can, you might not even be gay, but you're a guy, and maybe your dad thinks you're effeminate, and that's enough for him to lose it, right? That's right. One extreme, but the opposite extreme is that you're a 6-year-old, you're a boy, you play with dolls sometimes, and okay, you must be transgender. Kind of the opposite extreme of trying to lock it in early for whatever reasons.
Right, and then people say, come on, that doesn't happen. Yet we're seeing more and more stories where people are saying, yeah, that did happen, whether it's a parent or there's the story of a teacher who was trying to convince the child. It was a boy, I believe, who didn't want to use the bathroom. I think he had some bladder problem, so he was embarrassed. And she assumed, it must be because he's really trans. And he was 5 or 6 years old, and she was, trying to tell him about how good it is to be trans, and going on and on and on. And of course, the kid's 5 or 6. I forget how the parents found out about this, but they took umbrage with this. So this is happening, and yet every time we hear about it, these are anecdotes, but that means that it is happening, and people claim that it's not happening. And this is what worries me. And once again, as you were saying earlier, the fact is, once a child transitions, the rates of reversal prior to hormonal therapy are virtually nil. Almost everyone goes on to take further steps.
Well, not only that, but I was reading something because in England there's a lot of discussion right now about this, I forget what the name of this gender clinic is, GIDS is
Yes.
one of the terms they use. Travistock, yes. They have said at various times that hormones are completely reversible, that if you decide to desist, you just stop the hormones, life goes back to normal. I guess they're talking about puberty blockers, your puberty continues. But that's not really known. I guess the question is, in your experience with teenagers, the consequences of a transition, the consequences of the hormones, the consequences of surgery later, can, say, a 13-year-old, or even younger in some cases, understand the consequences of loss of fertility, or the loss of their genitalia if they decide to go that far, if they later decide to change their mind?
Abstractly, they can understand, but in a way that they would be able to make an informed decision, no, they cannot. It's something that just seems like something so far away, or it's, for a 13-year-old child, most 13-year-old kids are not seriously thinking about, oh, I want to be a parent someday. They understand the concept. They might say it, but to truly be able to say, my actions right now, the ones that I want now because this is what I feel is right and is going to help me, to think about how that will affect them down the road. Again, technically they have the ability, but psychologically almost no child or teen would be able to do that. That requires a functioning of the prefrontal cortex that they just really aren't engaging at that point. So no.
I mean, my experience, teenagers make a lot of really bad decisions. I remember a case out here where a bunch of kids were out camping and one of the vehicles broke down, so they all loaded up into a pickup truck, like 12 people, and then going around a curve, the truck rolled over. It was the kind of thing, like any parent would have said, you should have just come home with a van load, and we would have gone out and got you. Like, why did you make this stupid decision? But they're teenagers, right? Teenagers make rash decisions.
Yeah, and when I talked about the prefrontal cortex, especially teenagers, around 14 to 16, that's when we know actually that science has shown us that the prefrontal cortex, the decision-making, the judgment, that slows down that development, and the limbic system, the reward system, the gimme, gimme, gimme system, that's firing up at that time. That's nature's little joke, okay, to have both those systems both speed up and slow down at the same time, and that's why teenagers make such poorly thought out and rash decisions. And that's not just in the moment, a spontaneous, I want to jump in a truck, but it's also these types of, I want this now for me. And again, we're talking some very non-reversible treatments. And shame. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. I was just going to say, like, if it came to plastic surgery, I'm sure a lot of 14-year-olds would go for it, right? Make my boobs bigger or whatever.
Yeah, and reasonable doctors would say you're too young for certain types, and your body's still developing. We need to make sure that you don't do these things until your body's settled down, so to speak, and until you're old enough to make those types of decisions. Which is why most civilized countries have laws or policies where children, up until a certain age, cannot make certain decisions. And yet we're putting into the hands of young children, and if the gender or the transgender activists have their way, even as young as 3 or 5 years old are going to be allowed to make decisions that will change the rest of their life. And this is not hyperbole.
Well, how does the parental role occur? Because you've said in some cases parents are resistant. So in your experience, you've got parents who are going, we want to support our child, but this just doesn't seem like the right thing to do. But the child, of course, is strong-headed and saying, this is what I want. Is it then the therapist who kind of breaks the tie and says, your child's right, we need to move ahead with this?
Well, that's how it's been playing out, and we're saying child, so there's different stages. Most of the most serious concerns, I would say, is happening with teenagers with this rapid onset gender dysphoria. And I have a colleague in Australia who's at risk of losing her license because she keeps referring to that term. And her body is saying, well, it's not an actual term, so you can't say that. So I'm going to say it: rapid onset gender dysphoria. So these are, okay.
Well, if you get banned, don't blame me.
Too late. I'm already banned. So.
Yeah, that's true.
Right. I'm going to side on this. I'm going to take the side of science every time. So, so these are teenagers who, after showing, according to parents, literally no signs ever of any dysphoria or even, minimal to no gender non-conforming gender behavior, suddenly they're saying, I'm trans. And we know the research is showing that these, at least a quarter of these kids may have autism. A large percentage also have ADHD, or they have what's going to develop into a serious personality disorder, like borderline personality disorder. And these are not, you can't say that these are developing because of the gender dysphoria. We can say that these are things that are underlying issues, and they were there long before, and something happened socially that made these children say, oh, the answer to my question is, transitioning. I'm really trans. And these are children who are very vulnerable, or teens that are very vulnerable. And so parents are seeing this and saying, yes, could there be a small number of parents who missed the signs or who didn't want to see them or suppress them? Possibly. But when I've spoken to so many parents, they sound like genuinely concerned parents, and they said, we just want help for our children. So they took the children to the family doctor, who rightfully said, well, this is out of my area of expertise. I'm going to refer them to someone in the know. So they sent them to a gender therapist, quote unquote. They can be doctors, they can be psychologists, they can be social workers. And these are the people who, without the authority, would say, yes, your child is trans, and if you don't, put them on hormones or, listen to them completely and affirm their new gender, then they are going to kill themselves. And can you imagine a parent being told, if you don't do something that seems so bizarre and so radical and so out of the blue, that your child's their death will be on your hands? That's criminal to say that to a parent.
Okay, well, let's ask the question. It's often referred to, gender affirmation is often referred to as life-saving, and the only meaning I can find for that is that it would reduce the risk of suicide, because I can't see any other risk of staying with your biological sex, right? There's no, you're not going to have a heart attack, you're not going to, it's got to be a reference to suicide. So does gender affirmation reduce the risk of suicide in this group who have gender dysphoria?
Depends on which study you look at. So there are only a few studies, and these studies are biased because they only are able to follow the people who are doing well enough and I guess are happy with the therapist that they keep returning. So they're able to track them after going through some type of transition. And so, they don't look at the 40 or 60 or, even 80% of people who drop out of the study. So amongst the people who stick around, they say, look, their mental health is better now. Their rates of depression and anxiety are the same as any child, who of their age, not dealing with gender dysphoria, and they have lower risk of suicide. There's lower attempts or thoughts of suicide. So that's what some studies claim.
Well, I just like to read that back to you.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is an important scientific point, that if you have a trial where there's a large dropout rate, you cannot just look at the outcomes of those that continue with the trial. You have to ask yourself, what are some of the reasons why someone would drop out? And now it's unlikely that it would be suicide, because that would be recorded as a suicide during the trial. But it could indicate either your conditions are worsening or you're dissatisfied with the therapist because things aren't getting better. So you would expect the 40, 60, 80% of people who drop out to do worse, right? So you really can't use a study like that to say the risk of suicide is lower.
And to that I say transphobe. Say that. Okay. I mean, and that's the problem. What you just said is, any researcher would say exactly what you said, and yet when we point that out, we're called transphobes. So, and they say, well, why would you assume that something went wrong with them? Well, the assumption is for the very reasons you mentioned. So these studies are extremely biased, not by fault of the researchers,
no.
but they're being reckless in not putting enough caveats there, saying, look, don't assume that this means everything's going great, and they don't say that. And the trans activists we'll point to those few studies, and then when someone says, well, how about these studies that show, look, in fact, a few years later, after the honeymoon period, the rates of suicide are as high or higher than they were prior. And
another criticism of some of these trials is that there's a very short follow-up.
Exactly. And that's what I'm saying. The long-term follow-ups show that the rates of suicide, again, after the honeymoon period, do increase again, or they're as high as they were before. There's one study, and I think it's Thomas Stiesma, I believe. Stiesma. I see the name all the time, but I don't say it. And I think they were saying that that with the newer batch of trans people, they don't have, that it's looking promising, that maybe they are doing better, and again, so trans activists will look for anything that will justify their position. So they take a very, very selective look at what the data have to say. And if there's so much bad research and so many questionable studies and so many problems, especially with the dropout rates, I would say, okay, we have to be extremely cautious with where we're heading. And sadly, that's not what we're seeing. Now, I understand that as a trans activist with a self-serving agenda, which is something that they just want basically to say that everything's okay with them, they're normal, how dare you discriminate against them, etc. I can understand them to be that biased. But when psychologists and academics and doctors themselves are falling into the same trap because of political correctness or fear of having their reputation or jobs destroyed, that is when we get in problems, and that's why I've been speaking out against them for the last number of years.
Well, people have referred loosely to the trans lobby, and some people have been derided, as if there was this formal lobby group that's trying to turn everybody in the world into transgender. But are there people, what are the reasons why different groups of people, whether it's therapists or transgender people or they're the social justice warriors, what are the reasons why people would promote this affirm or people are going to die?
Well, the number one reason, and I don't think we have time to get into this, and this is the most controversial factor, and I've been teaching about this for many years, and then I finally spoke with the people who had been most strongly promulgating this theory, this idea that there are at least two different types of pathways towards through which people feel gender dysphoria. And one of them, I'll only get to the one, what we call autogynephilia. Mm-hmm. And you just say the word, and suddenly this is where you get the quote-unquote activists jumping down your throat. These are the ones who are most vocal. They cause the most troubles. They're the ones who get people banned. They start campaigns. They actually end up in positions of power. There's somebody in BC, in Canada.
Jessica or Jonathan Yaniv.
No, Morgane Auger.
Oh, okay, Morgane Auger. This is another one.
Yeah, and Morgane is an NDP. They ran for the NDP. They weren't successful, but they have a position and they're being respected and they're getting positions. So basically, these are men who have a fetish. It's a paraphilia, and I've spoken with a number of people with autogynephilia. And as long as we're not shaming them for it, and I don't shame them, I'm just saying, look, the reality is that you have a condition that really started to develop in puberty when your sexual interest started to develop, and you basically fell in love with the idea of being a woman. You got aroused to the idea of being a woman, to have your own body, your female body parts. And these are the people who, and this is what people have to understand, they are the ones who, again, they showed no signs of any cross-gender behavior as a child. They're usually quite masculine. They, as men, as adults, they become firemen, truckers, police officers. They have male typical jobs. The world's greatest athlete, Bruce Jenner, may be autogynephilic, although he denies it, but or he hasn't said it. So the point is, they have a paraphilia, and it got so severe that they end up feeling that they need to have some surgery to become this woman that they want to become. And again, it's an erotic.
So they're still attracted to women, but they're sexually attracted to themselves, or to their idea women, of themselves as a woman. So exactly. It's yes. I mean that is. And as you say, if that's what turns people on, that's fine. The question is, if you're trying to encourage other people to follow that path who may have different reasons for feeling uncomfortable in their body.
And that's the issue. they are pointing out to two different groups of people who have nothing to do with them. One are people with intersex conditions, so they were born with ambiguous or two sets of genitalia, or these other types of transgender kids who truly did, from a very, very young age, look, act, and feel like the opposite sex. I don't know exactly feel like, but that they say that they don't feel comfortable in their own physical body, and that's very different from these autogynephiles. So the reason they're promoting and they're using these people to promote this idea of transitioning early is it feeds into their delusion or lie or whatever you want to call it, that no, it's not a paraphilia, but this is who I am. This is the essence of who I've been since I was a young child. I've always known it. And the reality is, no, they weren't like that, because otherwise they would have been showing some signs when they were younger, because at that age they didn't know to hide it. If you look at the children who were trans from a very young age, they're acting out before they know that it's socially quote unquote incorrect to do so. These autogynephiles never showed any of that. So for them, and they might say, well, I felt different from a young age. Yeah, maybe, because maybe neurologically something was going on.
We don't know what other people feel. Like, I know that when I was in high school, I felt completely isolated from just about everybody else in the high school, but that was because I was much more interested in intellectual pursuits and things like that, and it seemed like everybody was paying attention to the athletes and all this kind of stuff, and laughing at me because I was geeky and that kind of stuff. I mean, it's obviously not as serious, and I got through it, but I think people focus on their own distress, and they don't realize, I didn't realize when I was in high school, there was probably hundreds of other children who were feeling similar distress, and I had no empathy for them because I just didn't understand that, I wasn't the only person who didn't feel like one of the group.
Right, and look, this is something that from all ages, but especially around the preteen to teen years, when you feel isolated. Even if you have friends, but if you don't feel part of that group, you feel that you're different. That's the number one thing, to feel different from our peers. It's terrifying, it can be devastating, and it can affect you for the rest of your life, and it can manifest in different ways. And so again, if you're a child who's vulnerable, who has maybe a certain condition, such as autism, where you're just, if you're provided an answer saying, this is why you feel this way, then you're going to latch onto it. It makes sense. And especially kids with autism, we know for a fact that they can ruminate and obsess over an idea. And so many of these kids, when they come out suddenly saying, I'm trans, just the day before or the week before, there was some event at school, or a friend of theirs had come out as trans as well. And suddenly they've become trans. And that's social contagion. And every psychologist worth their salt knows that social contagion, it's part of, let's say, when we talk about suicide, it can be part of, like, with eating disorders. We know it exists. So to deny that this could be happening for children when it comes to gender dysphoria and feeling that they're trans, to deny it is ridiculous. It goes against science, if that's what's happening.
Okay, let's talk about gender roles in the phrase gender conforming. Over my lifespan, the role of women in society has expanded dramatically. When I was a kid, female pilots were pretty unusual, female doctors, female vets. Now we have certain classes, university classes graduating with a majority female, but still in the media, women are portrayed as beautiful and delicate and sexually alluring, and men are shown as tough and rough, and the old gender roles are kind of still enforced, and is a difficulty with a child handling their own feeling about what they want to be. Is that at the root of some of these children's distress?
Oh, for sure. And that's why we know that many of the children who came to a young age to these gender clinics, if you didn't do anything, if you just let them be who they are, they ended up, first of all, they were for the boys, they were very effeminate, and they ended up just becoming regular gay boys. And some of them, though, the ones that continued who were gay, they just, and they don't deny, they don't think that they're a woman, they just say, I can't handle the role that is expected of me as a male. I feel more comfortable being effeminate, and I have a hard time being effeminate in my male body and being who I am, and I can't fake it. So if I'm in a female body, I'll be rewarded for that. I can do all these things, and I can be gentle and sexual and everything like that. And so, yes, have a discomfort in a gender role, not being able to live up to what is expected of you, that will contribute or can contribute to gender confusion and this gender distress or dysphoria.
Yes, I've interviewed one woman who's what she refers to herself as a butch lesbian, and in that case, they are, I guess, would be called tomboys when they're little, but for some women, they want to be like that, dress in men's clothes, be tougher than the average woman, and they can be a butch lesbian, or they could transition to be a quote trans man, which seems to be much more frequent.
Right, and if that's what they need to do, fine. And most of them, the ones I've spoken with, they have no pretensions. They know they're not an actual man. They just know it's easier to live in that role, and it is a role. And so this is where people are. I mean, they're wrapping their heads around these ideologies where they're trying to say that gender is social construct. No, it's an essence. It's what we're born with. People are having a hard time reconciling all of this. And just so your listeners know, I come from a very non-traditional family. My brother and sister were both adopted. My brother's black. My brother's gay. My sister's gay. My sister got married to another woman. My mother opened up Canada's first sex store in 1972. So I've been around sex and sexuality, and all the employees were women at first, and then the few men that came were all gay, and no one ever told me, "Hi, this is Bob. He's your gay, employee." It was, I was exposed to a lot of different types of roles, and it was just, it is what it is. We had very unstructured, kind of roles. Yet I was, I was not a typical kid in some ways, and very typical in others. I loved sports. I played around. I was like your typical dumb, crazy little boy. But I'm also left-handed, so I've got more of a female brain. I'm more sensitive. Maybe that's why I'm a psychologist. So there's in my particular family, we didn't have these strict gender roles, especially because, like I said, my mother was the breadwinner. My father was a crazy artist, literally. He had bipolar disorder. So,
yes.
Okay, and so we had very, very different, a different family. And because of that openness, when I'm working with people, I try to help them become comfortable with whoever they are, whatever they are. I say, look, I'm not going to change who you are. I'm going to help you maximize your strengths and learn to accept certain realities. And if a child had gender dysphoria, and I've got to be very clear here, I've worked with some people with gender issues, who end up becoming, trans, but I don't do gender therapy because I'm not specialized in that. I just help them come to terms with whatever issues were in their life and help them navigate. And that's what we should be trying to do. And many people, if we look at what's, their underlying causes, their family dynamics, maybe trauma, we will usually find, or we'll often find out, that if you can resolve those issues, then these other supposed, gender dysphoric issues or gender dysphoria can abate as well.
As humans, we tend to latch on to an ideology, which is kind of a conformity. And, the traditional ideology is that women get married, have babies, stay in the kitchen, and, men go out and do something tough, be a fireman or something like that. I think in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of pressure to smash conformity, right? People could go their own paths. But it seems like over time we have a tendency to create new conformities and new ideologies. And certainly the simplistic ideology that if you or your child feels like the opposite sex, then we must immediately transition them. It's almost like we are saying there isn't gender fluidity, there is male and female, and you can switch plus or minus, but there's much less emphasis on the in-between, or being a woman who likes sports, or a man who likes sewing, or something like that, right? Things that cross the so-called gender-conforming boundaries of the past.
Right, and that would be, that would make life much easier, except for the trans activists, because even if we were able to get people to be more open-minded and let children just be who they are and be as, different from the stereotype as they want or need to be. Even if that were the case, I'm telling you, the trans activists would still be promoting this idea that no, you have to make them go one way or the other, because I can't stress this enough. It's self-serving for them, and I'm talking about the autogynephiles because that's not what they're talking about. They have this need to see themselves as an actual woman, and so they would be promoting this idea. And no, there's no trans lobby, but there's enough of them. They get in touch with each other. I know this because on Twitter, if I ever said anything, I got banned from Twitter for life for using him/her, because I didn't know who I was talking to. I wasn't even talking to them. I was talking about them. I said, good luck with getting an honest response from him/her. That's all I said. I say this all the time. I'm a grammar. I'm anal for grammar, and
because you didn't know.
Sorry?
Because you didn't know if you were talking to somebody who wanted to be seen as a man or a woman.
Yeah, and I'm not going to check their profile. I'm too busy for that. I do that with everybody. If I don't know, if there's not an obvious name or whatever, him/her, if there's not a picture, a cartoon icon doesn't tell me anything. So, so I know for fact, because every time I'd say anything, a whole bunch of them would all dogpile me. And I don't care, I've got thick skin, but they would make complaints to my college. They would try to get me banned from Twitter. I'd get all these complaints. I'd get emails left, right, and center. I'd get reviews online. And it wasn't one or two. It was a plethora of them. So there may not be an official lobby, but they do definitely have lists of people, and they even brag about it, okay? And all the trans activists know where to go to get those lists. So the fact is, it only takes a few people with a really loud voice to be able to, to impose on society their needs and agendas, and that's what's happened. And so many people have kowtowed to them.
Right, and you described some of the consequences in that you got kicked out of the College of Psychologists of Ontario?
No, not the college. The Ontario that's an important distinction. The Ontario Psychological Association, which is a professional organization.
Okay, so the College of Psychologists is what registers you as a psychologist.
Yes.
And the association is kind of more like a lobby group to help produce events. But one of the things you said that it did, whatever other things it does, is it provides referrals. And by being banned from this association, you are then getting less referrals, which I assume would mean that it's going to cut into your income.
Well, ironically, I don't mind not getting the referrals because, a lot of my colleagues wouldn't refer them to me because they think I'm a hateful transphobe, okay? But B, because of my media presence, I've never advertised. I don't have to. I get referrals all the time. I wanted that referral service because I get contacted by many people because they hear me on the radio or see me on TV, and they have an issue that I can't help them with, or they're in a location that they're too far from me. So I told the college, now you got me going, the OPA, the Ontario Psychological Association, right? I said, please let me back on because I just need to be able to refer people to others. So yes, anyone else in my situation.
Right. So you're not worrying about yourself getting referrals. You're worrying about what do I do with somebody who comes to me with an issue I can't help them with.
Exactly. And I told that to them very clearly. And I said, look, they banned me originally because they didn't like my harsh message on the listserv. I would just post links and say, here's the latest update, here's another story, here's a video, here's someone else who's saying that they regret what happened, they wished that they had got help from professionals, to prevent them from transitioning. I would post these messages with a lot of harsh editorials, and they said, oh, it's too, your tone is too rough. So they banned me from that, and I said, look, you don't want to put me on the listserv? I don't care. Just let me be able to do my job and refer people when I can't help them myself. And the fact that they refused, it just goes to show you what kind of petty, small-minded, vindictive people we're dealing with. And these are psychologists.
Yes. Well, I sort of get the sense that things are changing. A year ago, I don't think I talked on this issue. I wasn't really terribly cognizant of what was going on. But one person who has started a lot of conversation around the world is the case of Jessica or Jonathan Yaniv in British Columbia, who took, I think, 16 estheticians who do Brazilian waxes, took 16 to court. And as far as I know, the human rights case is still going on. I think today or yesterday there were closing arguments in the case. But this seems to be somebody who putting together all the information that a person who's having sexualized conversations with 14-year-old girls, who seems to have a menstrual fetish, who wanted one of these 14-year-old girls to show a picture of their used menstrual pad to, put it online, for example. This seems like a person who's very disturbed and very narcissistic, and maybe one thing they've done is really start a question about, does unfettered acceptance of this end up in some ridiculous places, like putting immigrant women out of business because they can't do Brazilian waxes without having to treat men.
Right, and so I'm of two minds. First of all, this may be the tipping point. This definitely has brought more awareness, and I know it's turned a few people where they realized, oh my God, I didn't know it was this bad. And so on one hand, I'm glad that more people are aware of it. On the other, my concern is that once this happens, people are going to say, look, you're taking the one example, the one extreme example, and the rest of us aren't like this, so why would you pretend that she or he represents the rest of us? That's my fear, that they're going to, it's going to blow over, and people go, oh, phew, that was just one, really terrible person. And then another case will happen, and another. Less extreme cases will happen.
I mean, some in some ways have been more extreme. Like there was I think a person who renamed themselves Karen White in England, who was put into a women's prison, and then raped several women. Which I think the Anev case is much more dramatic because it's. But I mean, he was threatening the livelihood of women, and Karen White was raping them, which I think is a more serious offense.
Oh, for sure.
But there's been multiple cases like this. There's been other transgender women in Canada who've done these things, and that's certainly not to say that it's everybody. But as people have pointed out, if the standard for being recognized as a woman is because you say so, you really can't stop a seriously disturbed biological male from being housed in a women's prison just because they say they're a woman. And what's that going to do? Or a rape shelter, or going into a change room when they're still sexually attracted to young women, maybe underage women.
Right, and by the way, Morgane Auger, who we talked about before, who was previously supporting Jessica Yanev, was able to get a rape shelter closed down because Morgane wanted them to accept trans men, and
Morgane Auger didn't get it shut down, but they did manage to eliminate Vancouver City funding. The organization continues.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Important to get
that was the risk. That they're going to get shut down because of the lack of funding. Sorry. Yes.
And it's a real negative sign. I mean, when your city says we're going to cancel your funding, I mean, that doesn't look very good. It looks like there's something wrong with you. I think in this case it kind of backfired because a lot of women came out of the woodwork and some men and said, we need this organization and we'll fill in the gap of funding, that the city took away.
Right. And the problem is, though, with all these stories, and we can also talk about athletes, who are causing severe damage to people physically, like Fallon Fox, or who are erasing women's records.
Right.
Right. So the problem is, all these things are accumulating. Yet, if you talk to the average person, you realize they don't even know what's going on because the thing is, it's couched under something that I think you and I and everyone else, I hope, would agree on, which is the premise that they use, kind of the way they wedged their way in, is saying, we want fairness, we want rights, we don't want to lose a job, we don't want to lose housing, we don't want to be, attacked or assaulted, and then have someone say, well, it's called trans panic, so I'm not guilty of beating this poor person up, or murdering them. That everybody would agree with, I would hope. Okay?
Yes,
right?
Yeah, I think that transgender people have the right to be supported, whether that means, finding counseling that ends up with them deciding they're not transgender, or whether they go through their life as transgender and they should be able to have a job and housing and all of those different things. But the question is, do women have sex-based rights is I think a big issue that we're currently grappling with. And people like Yaniv are making a good case that women deserve these rights because some of his online postings have been that he wants to go in to a women's washroom and ask, he specifically said, 10 to 12-year-old girls if he can help them insert their use their menstrual device, their
tampons, yeah.
Tampons, sorry, forgetting the word. I mean, this is obviously a perversion, and the many transgender people who quietly used the opposite sex washrooms for years by, behaving themselves are going to be damaged by a small number who completely try to take it to the logical extreme, which is pretty extreme.
Exactly. And, again, when the stories become so let's say blatant that it's hard to ignore, you think, great, maybe something will change. But you know what? I find that people are just going to say these are one-offs, they're anomalies, and people are it's going to just subside, and it'll rise again and subside and rise again. And at some point, what people have to realize is every month or day that goes by like this, there are young, vulnerable people who are not getting the care they need, who are getting pushed into a direction that might be harmful, and very few medical professionals, William Malone is one, another endocrinologist, I know Michael Laidlaw, he's another, myself and a few others, very few of us are speaking out and saying, look, let's deal with these societal issues over here, but let's also rely on science and clinical evidence and find out what is the best course of action for vulnerable children and young teens to try to help them figure out what the best way to deal with their issues is. And that's not happening, and very few organizations are stepping out and saying the right thing. The ones who do stand out, they say, well, here's what we're declaring, and then they declare something that makes no sense medically or clinically.
Yes. I mean, do you think that there are a lot of professionals who quietly support you but are scared to raise their voice?
I know for a fact, because when I would have my battles on the OPA listserv, I would get so many people, usually the older ones, not the younger ones. The younger ones being brainwashed through education, quote-unquote education. The older ones said, look, I support everything you're doing. And I said, the first wave about 2.5 years ago, I said, okay, will you speak out? They go, nope. Don't want to do it, don't want to get the flack and everything. And I said, I understand. If you're not prepared, that's fine. But I got quite a few people who secretly back channel emailed me and said, I really, I support you in what you're doing. I'm seeing this too, or I had no idea. Thank you for that link. I didn't know. But they will not speak out. And the younger ones definitely won't, A, because their careers are just, they're just beginning their careers. They're vulnerable. And B, a lot of them, they just buy into this, and they're thinking so uncritically. And again, as a psychologist, it just blows my mind when I see these people saying things that aren't true and acting just like you would see any first-year university, social justice warrior, just using the same tactics and reacting emotionally and irrationally like you would expect, again, like a young adult or a teenager rather than a trained professional. And it blows my mind. And if we're not the ones who are standing out and saying, look, let's really make sure that we have best practices in place, if we're not doing that, who will?
Yes. You mentioned sports earlier. I was thinking, the silent majority, the people who are sort of family involved, they've got teenage kids, they don't have time for politics or anything like this, but they're really distressed when they realize that their teenage girl won't be getting a scholarship because a couple of transgender girls came in and took all the medals. I mean, those people eventually will speak up, right? Just like, professional people working with teenagers who are quiet, but at some point they'll feel like they can raise their voice, and I think things will change pretty quickly. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to hope so, but I'm not seeing that much. I mean, I'm seeing them speak out. It's making the news. And by the way, like when the story that you just mentioned, these two supposed trans athletes, they hadn't undergone any hormone therapy or anything like that. They grew out their hair. They were physical boys, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think it was in Connecticut. And there's more than that. I mean, there was a wrestling tournament where two Samoan women came second and third because a 40-year-old man was able to lift more weight. We're running towards the end of our time, so I'd just like to give you an opportunity to close out any issues that we should talk about that we didn't.
The only thing is I really hope that people hear this, and I'm hoping that with my background, my personal background, and my professional background, that people can understand that I'm not concern trolling, I think they call it, and I'm not, this is not some secret transphobic agenda I'm promoting. I have seen the science. The science is not clear. There are a lot of questions. What is the best way to treat people with different issues? It's not well known. But the fact is, we are blurring the lines. It used to be transsexuals. Then we came up with this term, some people came up with the term transgender, which is basically losing all meaning. Any child who, again, as we talked earlier, doesn't conform perfectly to a stereotype can say, well, I guess I'm gender queer, and gender doesn't exist, and so on. And the science is quite clear. Sex does. Biological sex does. Being a male or female does lead you to act in certain ways, and then a lot of the other ways are more, cultural or social or individual, and we have to make sure that that children and teens feel comfortable enough to follow their own path, but to also recognize that if they vary in any way from the stereotypical boy or girl, male, female, that's okay, but it doesn't make them the opposite sex, and that you can't become the opposite sex. And we need more people to speak out, whether it's about athletics, about protection, whether it's about best care. All of this, we can't. I want the public to realize that the people who are supposed to make these decisions, they are not making them in the most prudent and science-based manner. It's ideology, and the more people speak out, the more they are going to be forced to have to be held to account for their actions. And all I want them to do is say, you know what? We need more work. We need to try really hard to find out what's best for these kids and even adults. That's what I want people to take away from this.
Yes, I mean, I think what I've learned is that gender dysphoria is real. That what children need, teenagers need, is time. They need information, and they definitely don't need to be rushed into something that's irreversible.
Exactly, and they need compassion. And that's, we can still be very compassionate, but just not rush them, as you say, into something that's irreversible and can ruin their lives.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate a very informative discussion.
Well, thank you, and I really appreciate being given the venue to speak about these things, because more people have to hear about it.
Okay, goodbye.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to episode 226 of The Infectious Myth. If you have a comment, question, or suggestion for a future guest, please email me at david.crow@theinfectiousmyth.com. Like us at facebook.com/theinfectiousmyth. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at infectiousmyth. Commit to monthly donations of any amount to Infectious Myth, one word, on patreon.com or liberapay.com. Until next week, thank you and goodbye.